Welcome to The Detail. I am your host, Cathy Antunes, and you are listening to The Detail on WSLR 96.5, LPFM in Sarasota, Florida, and WBPV 100.1 LPFM in Bradenton, Florida. Well, Sarasota is going through a lot of growth, as everybody knows, and there are some really ambitious plans for the Bayfront, specifically the Bay Conservancy project around the Van Wezel. There are plans for a big park around the Van Wezel Performing Arts Hall. But there's also recently the city basically approved kind of a preliminary agreement regarding building a new performing arts center. It's projected to cost $350 million. Half of that coming from the city, half of that coming from a foundation, the Performing Arts Foundation. With me today to talk about Show Me the Money. Maybe that's what we should call this show today. Show me the money, because some of the concerns here are, where is the analysis? And Ron Cashton, you are a very engaged citizen, and you also have an extensive background in finance. You're familiar with performing arts halls. We also often marvel at the talent we have in this community. Ron, thank you so much for joining me today and for sharing the analysis you've done. Before we begin, just can you share with the audience who you are and
Sure.
how you got to Sarasota?
I'm a certified accountant. I originally began auditing were various publishing firms as well as theatrical firms, and in particular, the Schubert organization. My background dealing with the Schubert organization, when I heard about what the city was planning, something just didn't seem right. And that's where I started delving into it.
Okay. And the Schubert organization, I mean, that name rings a bell for me. I grew up outside of New York City. I was born there. The Schubert Theater is a famous Broadway theater, and that's what you're referring to?
The Schubert Theater is one of their theaters. They own most of the Broadway theaters. So the
Really?
Winter Garden is also a Schubert organization.
Wow.
Almost every major Broadway show is performed in a Schubert theater.
So you're no stranger to analyzing performing arts centers. And for people in the city of Sarasota or the county, anybody who's gone to the Van Wezel in the listening area, I think most people really understand that we value the arts and we want to maintain Sarasota's offerings, right, as an arts community. And there are a lot of things that happen also at the Van Wezel high school graduations. Both my sons had their high school graduations there. Speaker series. There's more than a few types of events, but this whole thing began, and it's been actually discussed, I think, for the better part of 2 decades, really, in terms of we've got all this surface parking right on the bay, right? All this huge parking lot. Wouldn't it be great if we could put it to a better use and also make space for all of our arts organizations? So in 2014, there was a prior effort, but then in 2014, people got very serious about the Bay Conservancy, which is now in an organization. Along with that, Ron, is the acronym is SPAC, Sarasota Performing Arts Center. And this is the entity and the foundation that's slated to be the new Van Wezel, right?
Yep. Yes.
Okay. So, we Americans love bigger, right? And we always want better. Sometimes I wonder if we really think about, is it always better? I'd like to, because you've given me 2 reports, and I have to say, for the listening audience, they are so full of information. There is the phase 1 analysis done by a company called AMS Planning and Research. It's dated to October 2015. And this is what the Van Wezel Foundation commissioned And so that's the analysis that's being done by the Van Wezel Foundation for a new performing arts hall. But you've gone and taken some of those assumptions and you've done your own analysis of the money and what has to happen for this to make sense. And I'm going to see, this is radio, but I want to see if we can walk through this in a way that makes it really clear. So Ron, can you see my screen now?
Yes, I can.
All right. So for those of you who are listening, I have to say, as Ron says, he's a super geek. It's totally true. I'm looking at a spreadsheet with 7 different options, or actually 8, 9, wait a minute, 10, 11. There's so many spreadsheets and analysis within this, but keeping it very simple, just your first spreadsheet. The Van Wezel Performing Arts Hall, Ron, currently seats about 1,750 people, roughly.
Right.
Yeah. And its average is about 80%.
Right.
Okay. And what they want to do, what's being proposed is 2,250 seats and a performing arts hall that would cost about $350 million. Right. So the city would be responsible for funding half of that, 175 million. And then the Van Wezel Foundation would be responsible for funding the other half, 175 million. And the existing building, the Van Wezel, would not be torn down, right? That's the agreement that was approved. Okay. So there's lots of stuff to unpack here. FEMA issues, competition issues. We could talk about acoustics, but we're going to start with the actual ticket prices and attendance.
Right.
So why don't you walk me through this particular scenario, Ron, and the assumptions and what's being proposed?
Absolutely. And I'm glad you brought up the AMS study that was done in the past, because they went in depth with a lot of aspects for the new Performing Arts Center, but they just glossed over the financial aspects. And being a financial person is also piqued my interest with that.
Yeah.
So with that, what I tried to do is try to figure out if the city was going to pay for their portion, as you described, $175 million, which is half of the proposed building construction. How is that possible? What would it take for the city to be able to do that? So in this spreadsheet, I began with, and this is the foundation's numbers. At the moment, they're thinking that their plans will cost around $350 million. And the city's responsible for 175 million of that. Now, the city has already a taxing district known as a TIF, and they're budgeting right now around $50 million that will come from the TIF. So what I try to do is not take the most pessimistic approach, because the most pessimistic approach always ends up with, it doesn't work. Let's take the most optimistic approach, saying if everything did better than one would expect, what would happen? So with that, I said, if the city owes $175 million and they budgeted $50 million from this taxing district, then in essence, the city only has to find financing for $125 million.
Yeah, which Ron, is way more than they've ever had to find for
in anything.
Anything.
Anything. And that's really where all the problem starts, because At that price, assuming that the foundation can do what they can do, right now, the city's plans is for this $125 million obligation to pay for this new building. They're planning on doing what's known as a revenue bond. And what that means is the $125 million will come solely from the cash generated by this new performing arts center, so that no one would be affected. This performing arts center would generate excess cash of $125 million to cover the obligation by the city. And that's where all these scenarios came through.
And to cover the interest on the
And
bond.
to cover the interest.
Okay, yeah. So you've got an interest rate here, you're assuming, so it's a 20-year bond, right?
Right. And
Um,
so,
ahead.
sorry, and even going forward, so I had picked a 20-year bond simply because most municipal revenue bonds are 20 years.
Mhm.
So if you want a bond that's longer than that, typically the city would have to pay more interest.
Okay.
But I figured let's do the simplest version. And I know this is really complex, and I apologize to the listeners.
I think you've spelled it out pretty well, though.
Oh,
So
great.
yeah.
And then for a 20-year bond, I took an example of an existing revenue bond that the city already has, and that goes to the St. Armand's parking garage, because the city recently went out to the financial market and said, we want to build an expensive building and we want to fund it purely on revenue. How much interest will you charge? And the financial community looked at the city and said, the city's pretty sound. We're going to give you, X number of interest percentage points above a Fed funds rate, or, a typical, like a mortgage. We're going to price you at around 7.5 or 7.6%.
Okay. So you have a really sound foundation for this interest rate.
Exactly. And the
Okay.
nice thing is, because we did have a recent revenue bond, there's no reason to think that our discount would be more or less than that. I mean, the
Okay.
price of this might make it more expensive, but again, being most optimistic.
Mm-hmm.
So for 20 years, if you had a bond that was worth $125 million, you would pay in interest alone $191 million on that $125 million bond. So the city's obligation, including interest, including taking every dollar from the TIF, would be $316 million.
Wow.
And unfortunately, yeah, as you could see, once you have that number, when you start saying, well, how much do I have to raise ticket prices to cover that?
Yeah.
Because again, it's a revenue bond. So usually where you make your money from performances mostly is the ticket price.
Sure. It's not popcorn.
It is not popcorn.
Yeah.
So in this scenario, and this is a great scenario to start with, if we say that the new Performing Arts Center is going to be as successful as the existing Van Wezel, and Mary Benzel has been amazing at her management with the Van Wezel.
Yeah,
And EMS,
I have to say, Mary Benzel, I think she's an outlier, right? Because
agreed.
if you assume the same success, I mean, this woman came and the Van Wezel was not doing well. She has huge expertise in the field. She has got a huge network and contacts. Honestly, finding somebody when she's ready to retire, finding someone to replace her is I don't know. It's a
Yeah,
tough one.
yeah,
So I think actually that's a big assumption that the success will be the same, but let's assume that it is. So
right.
you're doing
And, even if you found a replacement equal to Mary,
Mhm.
they have to be equal to Mary for the next 20 years. So
Right.
it's not like they can do well for 5 and then wane in, and then we get someone not as good. We're
Mhm.
making a commitment that we're going to find someone that, at that level.
Right.
And Mary has been able to manage the Van Weasel to a point where the average attendance per show is around 80%. Now they do have some sellouts, and of course they have some less well attended,
Mhm.
but overall the average is 80%.
Mhm. Yeah.
So one,
So
oh,
this
go
this
for it.
yeah, so just to jump in, so the number of seats is gonna jump up to, if the new building is built with the plans that they want, we're jumping up from 1,750 seats roughly to 2,250.
Right,
So that's a pretty big jump. Again, the attendance percentage, assuming it's the same at 80%. And
right,
I'm just gonna jump in, like, the total number of tickets, at that rate is 3,335,020 over 20 years.
yes,
Okay, and that then, with all those tickets, you gotta generate enough revenue to pay the bond and
right,
operating and maintenance, right? So you're taking a flat ticket price, but you're tacking on the amount needed to pay the bond.
right. And I am not considering, once again, being as optimistic, probably unrealistically optimistic. But for this show, let's just say that we're going with unrealistic optimism.
Yeah.
Um, we don't have any additional maintenance costs than we do right now.
Mhm.
If we just paid off the bond with more people coming and filling the new arena center at 80%, ticket prices would go, just to pay the bond, from roughly $75 to $170. You would have a premium of roughly $95
Mhm.
on a $75 ticket.
Yeah, and so just walking that back, right? Because you told us the total debt payment is $316 million. And then you've worked out the total number of tickets is like 3,335 hundred that 3,335,020. So it's not quite 100, right? But 95 gets you to that $316 million mark. $100 markup per ticket is
Right,
is huge.
right. So for this to be successful, not only do we have to maintain the 80% occupancy, but that 80%, so roughly the almost 1,800 people that are attending are willing to pay an extra $100 per ticket. That is the assumption in order to just pay off the building.
Which is, I
You
think, not, I mean, who's gonna do that, right?
who
It's
right,
already pricey.
right. You would think that when a family decides, hey, this Broadway revival seems interesting, let's take the whole family, would they still be willing to do that if the price more than doubled? So, giving you an example, a couple could now go see a show, let's say Mamma Mia. A couple could go for $150. Would that same couple go for 400?
Yeah, I think a lot, that's gonna price out it's already price. I mean, let's face it, most families don't go very often. It's mainly And in the consultant study, it makes it really clear, you're really talking about empty nesters, retired people. It's not families typically that go. Um, and if you're making the ticket price go from 150 a couple to 400, you've just priced out 99% of Sarasota. I would
Yep.
like,
Yep. And yes, and that's really where I got the alarm of saying, because the foundation right now has been so focused on aspirations, what would be the best center, and how expansive can we be without any financial constraints. This is kind of the results. It would almost be saying, if you were going to buy a car and
mhm.
you only had to pay for half of it, what car would you buy? Considering someone else will pay the other half no matter what it is.
Mhm. Yeah. And, I have great respect and appreciation for the people at the Van Wezel Foundation and the work that they do. And I'm just going to stop our screen sharing now. Ron, when you've looked at their own fundraising, because this is just the city's half of a $350 million project. Have you seen fundraising information that would suggest that 175 million is a reasonable goal for this foundation?
Now, their skepticism, I think, is due here, because I did take a look at the foundation's financials. Once again, being a CPA, and this is just the things that I do. I read
Mhm.
financials for the fun of it. I did notice that for 2001, for 21 and 2020, they did have a capital campaign for the new Performing Arts Center of ending in roughly 2021, about $10 million. So they have 10 million. If they were still doing this goal, they would still need $165 million. And given the climate of the orchestra looking for new funding, Selby looking for new funding, all of our institutions always looking for new funding,
Right.
is that capacity, that excess capacity available with
Right.
everybody going on?
With the philanthropy, yeah. So the scenario that you just discussed, you titled it "Replace Orchestra Programming." And
Yes.
one of the things that has changed recently, right? Because this consultant study done for the Van Wezel was done in 2015. And it's interesting because the projected completion date for the building is November 2020. So we're way past, right? The the expiration date on the study, yet that data is still the best we've got from the foundation. Um, we know now that the orchestra is saying they're definitely leaving and they're building a new building. Um, there's a lot to unpack with that, but what's important about that, Ron, when it comes to building a new performing arts hall in downtown Sarasota?
There, there's naturally going to be some competition insofar as the orchestra has always wanted more shows in the Van Wezel, and there's always been that give and play between all the other programming that Mary provides and the orchestra.
Hmm.
The orchestra is building a very expensive new building that, in addition to just moving their shows and
And they're moving to Fruitville and Cattleman. That's what
yep,
the plan is. Yeah,
yep,
that big empty field with the cows.
yes.
Right? Yeah. So,
Some of the other musical programming that naturally may have gone to the Van Wezel, one would think is going to go to this new symphony hall. Naturally, there's going to be new competition out there because the city, we're blessed with so many cultural resources. How many cities of our size have an opera house, have municipal hall, which, we've just recently learned that the players, wonderfully are going to occupy.
Mhm.
We also have various small little theaters.
The West
West
Coast
Coast
Black Theater
Black
Troupe.
Theater is
Yeah.
there. Um,
Florida Studio Theater, the
Florida
ballet,
Studio,
the
the ballet,
Oslo. Yeah, we've
the
got a lot.
yeah, both Oslos. You have the new Oslo as well as the historic. You also, because the orchestra is moving, we now have Holly Hall that's vacant that the city's going to do.
Where
So
they
we're
currently are, right? And
right,
that's 450 seats
right.
there. Yeah.
So we may go from a bounty of different venues to excess capacity. And
Mhm.
that's a real concern because
Yeah.
once again, you have all these different organizations being tremendously aspirational and inspirational and trying to bring culture to the community, but they're all competing, and they're all competing particularly for season.
Mhm.
One thing that was interesting that came up is one of the ways that they're hoping to pay for the new art center is lengthen season, saying, why can't we have programming during the summer? And what was interesting in that AMS report is
Mhm.
the Kravitz Center over in West Palm tried to do summer programming. They try to go year round too because the Kravitz Center is so expensive. They
Okay.
tried for 2 years and ultimately decided it was unprofitable and ended it.
And this
So
again, where is this in West Palm? Is that
that was in West Palm.
okay?
And again, that came from the Van Wezel Foundation study. So, although I'm trying, it doesn't sound like I'm trying to be optimistic, but truly these numbers are optimistic because if you have this capacity and you have this large debt and you're trying to pay for it just through tickets, my concern is, and I did actually approach the city manager, Marlon Brown, with these, saying, I don't want the city to be in a position where you have a foundation going out and doing planning and doing design for something that ultimately the city could not pay for. Because I'm
Right.
sure the listeners now realize what I'm describing, what banker would do this? They look at this and say, clearly these numbers don't make sense. I'm not going to do the bond.
Yeah.
So even if the commissioners decide this is a wonderful idea, we're going to spend $350 million, I'm not sure the city could do it at the end because there's no bank that would fund these numbers.
And that's the thing. When I saw this vote being moving forward, um, I what really concerned me was the lack of analysis and the monumental amount of money. I mean, we're a city of 55,000 people. Actually, the population has not changed that much, despite all the perceived growth. The city's population actually remains relatively stable. Now, the outlying area, and there's really a lot of analysis in this foundation study about the primary market area, which is like within 45 minutes to an hour drive from the Van Wezel. And then there's the secondary market, which is a 90-minute drive. But, I've been watching local government for a long time, even with baseball stadiums. Nothing approaches $350 million for spring training. This is more than 3 times those numbers, and we've been fortunate in Sarasota to keep those costs down. But to look at this level of spending, and now we know the orchestra intends to build. I mean, one of the things I found really interesting, Ron, I'm going to need to break in a minute, but I do want to get into how this is a phase 1 consulting study. In other words, and it's actually 7 years old, right?
Mhm.
It was completed in October 2015. And that's what's being used at the commission table. And frankly, we didn't even see this on the Elmo, on the overhead. None of this was really discussed. But they talk about, they had 3 scenarios, and it's acknowledged in this study that the orchestra is a huge factor. Are they going to be teaming up? Are they going out on their own? And one of the recommendations in this, just preliminary, because they say there should be 4 studies, phase 1, 2, 3, 4. But one of the recommendations the consultant makes is there's the potential to book programming in the orchestra's building and be a
Yep.
partner or be a renter. And there's a potential to actually manage the orchestra's building, and team up. And I was like, nobody's talking about that. Can this community really absorb 2,000 seat, in that neighborhood venues? Are you seeing any good analysis of that question?
None, none. And all I agree with you. When the study was done, the orchestra was a big question. They never went into what the scenario would be is if this new performing arts center was actually in competition with the orchestra. One thing that was interesting in the study, though, they did go into, and we can discuss this after the break, they
Mhm.
did go into the history of the Van Wezel. And early on, there weren't other big regional performing arts centers around.
Mhm.
So we were fortunate enough to get some programming that now may not be possible. And it's one of the things that's driving this size, the magnitude of the building that the foundation's hoping for. But even if you build the building, could we obtain that programming?
Okay, so I want you to hold that thought. Everybody, you are listening to The Detail on WSLR 96.5, LPFM in Sarasota, Florida, and WBPV 100.1 LPFM in Bradenton, Florida. August 23rd is primary day, and it's actually election day for the Sarasota County School Board. There have been a lot of changes regarding voting. Make sure that you're registered. Go to sarasotavotes.com to check your registration. And if you're not, make sure you do register and make a plan for your vote on August 23rd. August 23rd is the election day for the Sarasota County School Board. Other important races will include our city commission, our county commission. Your vote matters. No one else can weigh in for you at the local level. Be sure to be involved. Go to sarasotavotes.com and votemanatee.gov.com. So, Ron, let's take a look at this competition question and the primary market question. Because as you said, the Van Wezel, and Ron Cashton is my guest, we're talking about building a new performing arts hall, and show me the money. Does this make any sense? It's been really concerning that financial analysis seems to be missing from the city commission discussions. You've got this primary market area. Now you're looking at 2 potential performing arts halls, the orchestra, and a new Van Wezel, so to speak. But Ron, there are blackout dates with concerts that, these venues are very conscious of the potential for cannibalizing their own ticket sales. And so when they enter into contracts with vendors, with a show, a Broadway show or a dance show, they put limits on their contracts. Can you talk about what they are? Explain to the audience why, cannibalizing ticket sales is an issue?
Sure. And so let's say that you're a touring company, and I'll pick Hamilton because that usually is the show that everybody talks about. So you're a touring company of Hamilton, and you're looking in the Florida area, in the state of Florida, of where to show where to set up the performance. What they'll do is they'll try and find a venue that will give them the best chance at the biggest revenue.
Yeah, they
That
want to sell. They want to sell out, right?
right, right, that
Mhm.
they have an audience large enough to hopefully sell out time and time again. So to some extent, it doesn't, what these shows will do is if a show comes to Tampa, they'll make sure that in essence, no one in driving distance of Tampa, they won't do another performance in any other venue within that driving distance. So that if you're in Sarasota and you want to see the show, you will come to Tampa as opposed to waiting for Sarasota. That way, they're not cannibalizing every show.
Mhm.
um, because they only have a limited number of runs. So with that, some of the most popular shows, the reason why they're going to Tampa as opposed to Sarasota is simply Tampa is a larger metropolitan area.
It's a
No
larger
matter
market.
right.
Yeah.
So no matter how much we grow, we will never be larger than Tampa. We will never be larger than Orlando, and certainly never larger than Miami.
Mhm.
So to some extent, we are competing with those venues. And that's what I brought up before. When the Van Wezel was first built, there were less of these regional venues. So when
Mhm.
a show came around, or a band was trying to book places, Sarasota was the only place around. Now there's a lot of different competition with various metropolitan areas. So even if we book this, let's say we built this incredible art center, there is no guarantee, or actually less likelihood, that we would still get Hamilton. Why? Because if you're the producer of Hamilton, you have a better chance of selling out if you're in Tampa, if you're in Orlando, if you're in Miami, than going to Sarasota.
Mhm.
And
Right.
that will just never change.
And going to Sarasota the following week can hurt your ticket sales in Tampa.
Right, right. You're not going to sell out in Tampa because people are
Mhm.
waiting for
Yeah.
Sarasota.
Why should I? Yeah.
Right.
And so these contracts stipulate, so let's say how this show, and we're saying Hamilton, that they say, okay, Strass Center, we are going to, you're first on our list, which from a business perspective, I think the Strass Center, I think it was Kelly, your wife was telling
Yep.
me it's the largest performing arts hall in the southeast of
Yep.
this country, right? So it's number one for people who, for these vendors, these touring groups. So they're going to Tampa, they're going to the Straz, they want to optimize their sales. And when the Straz says to them, yes, we want to have you, and you have to promise you're not going to go here, 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 and here. You're not going to go to Clearwater, you're not going to go to Sarasota, you're not going to go, all these places in Lakeland, whatever, then, it doesn't matter if we have a bigger whoop-de-doo auditorium, we're not going to get that show.
Right, right.
Yeah.
And it's really that fallacy, the trap that I'm wondering if the foundation is currently in, saying, well, if we had a larger center than the Van Wezel, maybe we could attract these shows.
Mhm.
And yes, that's a maybe, but still the likely chance of Tampa outbidding us, or just the likelihood that a large touring company would go to Tampa,
Yeah.
will always beat us out.
Yeah. And this is something that in the medical arena, you look at it, the state issues certificates of need. And, with medicine, it's different. But say you have a cath lab, you're not going to cannibalize, you're not going to cause your cath labs to fail. They're needed. And the state has to say, yes, you can build one. So that we all know they're going to be okay, they're going to thrive. And performing arts halls, there's not that kind of restriction. So I put something else up on the screen here, Ron, for us to talk about, because the nature of the show and whether or not they sell out, I found this in the consulting report, and I found it pretty interesting that the shows that sold out 95% capacity, um, variety, and I guess that's kind of a catch-all category, but this variety category is responsible for the most nearly sold out or sold out shows. And then after that, it's the Broadway show.
Right.
It's the Broadway show. And coming in next is dance. And then at the very end are the orchestra shows, with one show, the number of shows in a single year that sell out or get to that 95% mark for the Sarasota Orchestra, or it just says orchestra, it might include others. There was one in each year between, and actually 2012, there were none.
Yep.
And I know it's a little bit off topic, but I wanted to ask you, do you have concerns about, seeing data like that about the performance of the orchestra? I mean, their plan is to build something pretty large. And if
Right.
their
Yes.
track record is not filling these venues, what about that?
Yep. And in the past, the orchestra has been working with the Van Wezel. They were always coordinated all their performances. And now they're going into direct competition. And you're absolutely right. If the orchestra is seeing, large vacant seats, they're going to have to put in programming that fills them. So some of those variety shows, some of the music acts, I'm sure are going to go to the orchestra just so that they can pay for their hall. So in the past, everything funneled into the Van Wezel. Now you're going to have two separate organizations fighting amongst acts that may be coming to the city.
Yeah. Ron, what's your take on, well, it seems that a collaborative approach would be a lot more financially wise for everybody, to have one major venue and to have, sharing, collaboration. Philanthropists, donors wouldn't be asked to be contributing to more than one. So I'm curious what your take is on what are the barriers to collaboration. I mean, do you think that that's the best way to go? It certainly seems like it would be.
You would think, but it's strange that you almost have not-for-profit capitalism here, insofar as the city has tried year after year of collaborating with the orchestra to say, hey, let's get together and maybe we could find some unified answer here.
Because I want to jump in, because they've been leasing Holly Hall to the symphony for next to nothing. I mean,
Yep,
I don't know.
$1 a year.
Yeah, okay, it is $1 a year. Yeah.
Yep.
So the orchestra has not had the overhead of having to build a building ever before.
Yep. Yep. Or maintain it and everything else. So you have these separate organizations that are more myopic in that they're focused on their particular visions and their particular goals. So the orchestra is saying, wanted to build the best hall for the orchestra. And it's, whatever my personal opinion is, I understand that an organization would operate in the best interest of the organization, but that may not be the best interest of the city.
Yeah,
So where the orchestra decided we're going to go our own way, it does have impacts for the rest of the cultural
yeah,
community in Sarasota.
it totally does. So bearing that in mind, um, I did not see this meeting, but the municipal auditorium shifting over to the players, the players were going to go out to Lakewood Ranch, and now they've decided that it's not feasible for them. The building costs are too high. And the municipal auditorium has been offered as a solution. And yet at the meeting, just the other day, we've got the Bay Conservancy stepping in and saying, hey, wait a minute, city, we get to decide that, not you. It, and so, I mean, look where,
Yeah,
I mean, does that make sense? I was kind of shocked to hear that.
agreed. And this gets back to the beginning of the show when you discussed back in 2005, there was something known as the Cultural Park, where the city took a holistic approach at the buildings around the Bayfront. This was before, really, I think, the Bayfront 2020, where they said, we've got Holly Hall, we've got the Municipal Auditorium, we have the Van Wezel, maybe we can create some type of cultural park here.
Yeah.
And it was one that was going to be holistic. So it's interesting that now the Bay is kind of pushing back at that model where,
Mhm.
so many cities have been successful. And going forward with that too, one thing that was interesting about the AMS study is they discounted the Van Wezel long-term because they said, because of FEMA, we can't renovate it. But what is interesting about FEMA is that FEMA does have an exception for any historic building. And the Van Wezel, now being 52 years old, the city could designate the Van Wezel to be historic, and therefore the 50% FEMA renovation limit no longer applies.
Would no
So it
longer
is
apply. Yeah.
possible. Yeah, so it is possible. And I was surprised about that too. I thought that the Bay would say, hey, this is great. We're going to make this amazing park. We'll help maybe renovate the Van Wezel, keep that going. We have the players going in the municipal auditorium. We're going to soon have Holly Hall. We have like this terrific area downtown.
Yeah, yeah. So when we talk about the AMS, this is the consulting report, the phase one report that the Van Wezel Foundation is using. It is 7 years old actually, and one of the things it says in there, um, it doesn't include operating and maintenance costs.
Nope.
So all of these financial assumptions don't look at the cost of maintaining this new building. It also assumes that the existing Van Wezel will be demolished. So you and I are talking about competition, and the orchestra is a question mark. What has changed is this agreement says the Van Wezel won't be demolished, the most recently approved agreement. So there's potential competition. I mean, how's the Van Wezel going to exist if it's not used, right? There's no operating and maintenance projections in their consulting report, and the orchestra's building a new building.
Yeah.
So, I mean, to me, it's like start over.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, you don't even have a report, although there's very good information about the competition and all. But how do you put together a financial prospectus without including operating and maintenance costs?
Yep. Yep. And how do you put a proposal in front of the city, in front of the taxpayers, without a way to pay for it?
Yeah, right. And God, like I say, God bless the work that these folks do with the Van Wezel Foundation. But I've had a number of people very familiar with philanthropy in Sarasota say, what they're saying they can do so far surpasses what they've done in the past. I mean, you said right now they have $10 million, you know,
Right.
maybe there's some other money we don't know about. It's nowhere near 175 million.
No,
Are we expected to partner as city taxpayers to seriously partner with an organization that doesn't have the funds and
well,
doesn't have a reasonable expectation of getting there?
right. I mean, it would be as if someone came to you and said, I have 1/16 of the purchase price. Do you want to go ahead?
Yeah, let's build a house.
Let's
Here,
build a
I'm gonna
house.
give you I'm gonna give you 5% or 10%. Yeah. And again, in the consultant report, their projected cost for a facility was 160 million. It
Yep.
wasn't the 350, you know?
Nope. Nope.
That doesn't include parking. It doesn't include, all the other infrastructure, lighting and stuff that would have to go into that park. And so I rarely, I've never been more alarmed by an agreement than I was by this one. And just the like, is there such a thing as toxic optimism? I'm
Yeah.
like, is there really a plan here? Or do you all just, because we've made pictures and we've said we're going to do something, we're just going to keep believing that we're going to do it? But there's fantasy and then there's grounding the fantasy in reality. And this is our government,
Yep.
right?
Yep. And
So,
looking at that agreement that you were talking about, the one that the commission agreed to sign,
mhm,
the preliminary operating agreement, the commissioners did take out the $350 million price tag, but what they did not take out of the agreement, what the city agreed to, was the specifications of the building.
yeah, the
So
square
they basically,
footage,
the
right?
square footage, everything else, they just
Yeah.
merely said, I'm not going to tell you how much it's going to cost,
Hmm.
but we're going to build this grandiose building.
Yeah.
So
Yeah. I forgot to mention, so, again, in the consultant report, and they put together 3 scenarios, Ron, but one of the things I thought was really interesting, and regardless of the scenario, they're saying that the foundation for this new performing arts hall should add 173 rental events.
yep,
That's 3 per week, 3
yep.
rental events. What is that exactly? Where is it gonna come from? And I was just like, "Wow, that's a big, magic wand type thing." So I don't know, there's a lot more questions, I suppose, than answers. Um,
And Kathy, I'll do you one better. When you brought up that both your children graduated from
mhm,
at
yeah,
the
the
Van Ways, if
ceremony,
they
I was
went,
there.
yeah, if they went to the new Performing Arts Center, because the Performing Arts Center has to charge those additional premiums rather than being a free ticket, would each graduation, would each student have to pay $95 just to graduate in order to pay
Yeah,
for the bond?
for mom and dad to see them walk. I don't know. So there are a lot more questions than answers. I'm not seeing the answers. It's really concerning. Obviously, we're gonna keep our eye on this. Just final idea, Ron, if does it make sense for us to be putting a new facility near the water?
Yeah, um, there, it's hard to justify that this would be the ideal place for a building that you want to keep around for 50 years.
Mhm.
Just even if you elevated it, what about the parking? What about the various flooding? I mean, the city has plenty of property around the city
Yeah,
that, yeah, if you were going to spec out a new facility, although the bayfront is beautiful, I am not sure that's where you wanted to put your 50-year building.
no, not much money, not much investment. So we only have a few minutes left. Ron Cashton, what would you like to see the city and these organizations, the Performing Arts Foundation, the Van Ways, what would you like to see them do?
I would love to see them take a step back and do a holistic, realistic approach. What they've been doing has been very, very aspirational, but there's real life constraints. And I would love to see, rather than a citywide argument where you pit cultural people against financial people, people that are struggling just to pay their costs, worried about taxes rise. Um, I think that there's a win, for everybody here, but
Mhm.
it does take both organizations. It does take the foundation and it does take the city to come together and say, here are our limitations. Here are our constraints. What's the best we can do for that?
Yeah. And how about that, the orchestra would be
Yeah,
nice.
the orchestra is tough. It gets back to, again, that, not-for-profit capitalism, which, um, there's when a organization goes on their own, which they have every right to do,
Yeah.
one wonders, you want them to succeed, and it's hard to know how this is going to pay off, how they're going to be able to fill that when they were struggling, to fill the Van Wezel right now, exactly what you said.
Yeah, they were, I think the orchestra is great, but they were the lowest performing type of event when it came to selling out, um,
Yep.
at the Van Wezel, and I'm hoping that they're recognizing those constraints. Well, Ron Cashton, thank you so much for joining me. There's, I have to say kudos and thank you for the analysis that you've done. We've really scratched the surface, but people like you make a big difference in our community, and hopefully we get to better solutions. So
Yep.
thank you for the work that you do.
And
Appreciate
thank you, Kathy.
Absolutely. Everyone, you've been listening to The Detail on WSLR 96.5 LPFM in Sarasota, Florida, and WBPV 100.1 LPFM in Bradenton, Florida. August 23rd is actually Election Day for the Sarasota County School Board, and it's an important primary day for national, state, but also local races, the City Commission, as well as the County Commission. So voting laws have changed. Be sure you're registered to vote. Go to votemanatee.com or sarasotavotes.com. Find out if you're registered, if your registry is current. Do you want a mail-in ballot? All of these things you can plan your vote, show up on August 23rd. Thank you all for listening. Make it a great day.